Thank you. Recording in progress. All right. Anyone have any questions left over from previous sessions?
I don't know if it's a question, but it's a comment.
Please,
And
Suzanne.
it just seems to me, I don't know whether it's the way he puts it. It seems to me that it's a little bit different. The story, if you want to call it that, is just trifle different from what I have learned. And this seems to me to be more authentic.
So are you talking about Telushkin's writing up of the story?
Probably, but also some of the ways that you present it. I like it very much, but like I said, I wish everybody could get this. It's just a little bit different. And for some reason seems more authentic, more believable, more, yes, that was what it was, or that is what it is.
You know, here's part of the problem, I think, Suzanne, is that if we learned these stories, we learned them when we were quite young.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, so some of them were rated X because the Bible, you know, everyone's favorite X-rated book.
Right.
So I think that, you know, gives us an incomplete picture. Mm-hmm. And when we get, you know, a more accurate picture, we feel like, you know, that's not the way I learned it, because they don't give you the full story. Because the full story, look, you know, we talked about the Torah, and the Torah has a lot of mitzvot that we would not be proud of today, right? There's, you know, like the commandment to commit genocide against the Canaanites, which you'll be glad to know that they didn't actually do, because there were a lot of Canaanites around over the, you know, the succeeding centuries, right? But I'm going to guess that most of us, I know I was not told that when I was a kid. Okay. I think that's a frequent experience for people who reread the Bible when you're over the age of 13.
Way over the age of 13.
Well, I'm definitely way over the age of 13. So
no, I agree with you. I was just telling my brother and sister-in-law that I was taking this course, and they were like, well, it's like an adult education. You know, it's viewing Judaism as an adult, not as a kid.
Yes. So hopefully, you know, that will be of value to all of you as we continue. Other comments or questions before we dig in? So let me ask you about the assignment that I gave. I suggested that you compare the Shabbat mitzvah in the two versions of the 10 Commandments, one in Exodus chapter 20, one in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Anyone find anything interesting there? All right, hearing no responses, let me just put my list of things up here on the share screen. All right, so as we said before, one says remember and one says guard the Sabbath day to keep it holy, which was later interpreted to refer to the positive things we do, to take note of Shabbat, and the things that we don't do to kind of put a fence around Shabbat and protect it from, you know, so that it doesn't become like other days, right? Now, here are some things that are specifically added to Deuteronomy chapter 5 that we don't find in the version in Exodus, right? So there is the phrase, as God has commanded you, right? Now, we don't know exactly why that was added in Deuteronomy. We do have a pretty good idea that the Deuteronomy version is a later thing. So if the later source adds this phrase, they probably want to underscore that this is a divine commandment. And maybe the reason they want to underscore that is because people are neglecting it. Could it be? Is it possible people could neglect the Sabbath? And let's say in the year, 2620 before, 620 before the Common Era. So over 2,600 years ago. Think people might have been neglecting it then? Well, could be, right? So they make a point of reminding you, this is not just stuff that we're making up. This is God's stuff, right? They add the phrase, your ox and your ass, who also get to observe Shabbat, right? Why do you think they added that phrase?
Well, absolutely no work would be done because the ox and the ass were like the tractors of those days.
That's correct, right? And you think maybe people were out plowing on Saturday?
Of course.
Could have been, right?
These are the people that, made or their family were the one that made the golden calf. So
yes,
yeah,
I mean, we're talking about, some time later, but still, right?
It's got that
The people
memory
who
is
come
going to
right
be
from
there.
Sinai to make a
Mhm.
golden calf. You think, a few hundred years later, people might be, neglecting certain laws and rituals, you think?
Of course.
Sure, right? And then in Deuteronomy 5, it repeats the phrase, male and female slaves, right? Both Exodus and Deuteronomy make clear that Shabbat is for your slaves too. Deuteronomy repeats it. Why would they repeat it? Well, you know the answer by now, right? Because people weren't doing it. They were not letting their slaves have a Shabbat. Right? And so they get it in there an extra time just to remind everyone, just to remind them that that's a no-no. Okay. Last piece. Okay. Okay. So Exodus and Deuteronomy actually give different reasons for the whole mitzvah of Shabbat. In Exodus, it says you do it because in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth. Okay? So it's like, this is, you are to imitate God in this particular way, right? So it's partly a ritual, right? It's a ritual that sort of replays the original creation. Deuteronomy gives a different reason. It says, because God freed you from Egypt. God let you go, helped you go out of slavery. Therefore, you shall keep my Shabbat. What would motivate this difference in Deuteronomy chapter 5?
Jewish guilt.
Well,
Just
say a little
kidding.
more about that, Daniel.
Yeah. Well, I did this for you. You owe me. I'm kidding. I'm sorry. I'll shut up. I'm being too.
No. You're on track, but you got to get to the end of the track. Right? Yes.
It's an obligation of partnership. It's an indication that a covenant isn't me telling you what to do. It's you're going to do this and I'm going to do this. It's a tit for tat, zero sum game, if you want to call it. But God has already done this for us, and it's an obligation for us to commemorate that and to observe it. Is that better?
So you're, that's a big part of it. But the other piece is, again, this notion that because you were freed from slavery, you should maintain the Shabbat for yourself and for everyone else who is with you, and even the animals, even to the point of saying your ox and your ass. Why? Because God takes you out of slavery to be free. You should imitate God in this way and allow your slaves or your indentured servants, which is what slavery for the Jews was more like, right? You let your indentured servants also have a day off. Okay. So all of these differences are a matter of history, right? And the historical influences that weighed heavily on whoever authored the book of Deuteronomy. Okay. Questions? Comments? Okay.
I'm sorry, you go on. You go on,
Suzanne?
Suzanne.
There are other things, aren't there, within the Bible that the same story or the same command or something is told in two different places in different ways?
Yes, and sometimes this same reason about, treating your slaves well is associated with that. So, for instance, it says, leave the gleanings in the field for the poor, right? Why should you do that? Well, in Deuteronomy, it tells you, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, right? And eventually they too have to go free. You can't be slaves forever. Okay. And by the way, relating to this, there is one more thing you should know very well about the Torah. There is one command that is repeated in many different places, sometimes with different words, but basically the same idea. It is, do not wrong the stranger. You were strangers in Egypt, and you should know better. Do not wrong the stranger. You can look up Exodus 22:20 if you're interested. That's one of the first expressions of that. Okay, so moving ahead.
Rabbi, just a
What
very quick
happens
question.
to the Israelites after Moses' death? In other words, Deuteronomy is not the end of the Bible. Right? It's just the end of the Torah. So we go to the book of Joshua, the first book in the second part of the Tanakh. Remember we mentioned, there's Torah, and then the second part is Nevi'im, the prophets. All right? Joshua is early prophets, even though Joshua himself is not necessarily considered a prophet. It's just history. And everything from in the first part of prophets is history. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. So the biggest problem that the Israelites have in invading the land is that there is one city that is surrounded by a large wall. You all know what that city is, don't you? Jericho. Okay? And the Jews don't have the kind of weapons that you would need to knock down a big wall. They don't have battering rams. They don't have ladders. They don't have dynamite. All right, okay, this is 3,500 years ago, or 3,300 years ago. No one has dynamite, but you get the idea. God has this covered, right? They march all around the city once for 6 days and 7 times on the 7th day with the Kohanim blowing the ram's horn, which is a shofar, right? And all the people give a mighty shout and the wall collapses and the Jews run in and take the city and they tear it down. Telushkin describes this as part miracle and part psychological warfare. Okay? The miracle part may be a myth, but the myth is important. It explains why the other inhabitants of the land might have been more likely to give in to the Israelites or to have felt that it was hopeless to resist them. If God is on their side, if the God of Israel is doing miracles so that the wall of Jericho falls down, what chance do the rest of us have? Right? We best, better work something out with it. Right? So in any case, Joshua is said to pronounce a curse on anyone who would ever rebuild the city of Jericho, that both their firstborn son and youngest son would perish. And 1 Kings chapter 16 tells that after 4 centuries, an Israelite man does just that. And guess what? Joshua's curse comes true. Now, Joshua's curse may have been just as much a legend as the collapse of the wall, but that's what the Tanakh tells us. That is the story. The rest of the book of Joshua tells of the other battles the Israelites fought in order to claim the land. As Telushkin says, it is not pleasant reading. It is ugly. That's war for you. Actually, in the Torah, as I mentioned, there's this specific command to kill all the Canaanites, all those wicked idolaters. We know that that was not fulfilled from archaeological evidence and later descriptions in the Tanakh that many of the Israelites took Canaanites as spouses. So they weren't all killed. But it's likely that there was an enormous amount of killing involved in the war of conquest. And, obviously this bothers us because the Torah itself insists that we should revere human life, that we should love our neighbors, right? It's also likely that the only way the Jewish people was going to be able to exist in that time, to have some place to live, was to kick out some of the others. And of course, if you want to have a different way of life, which doesn't involve any of the Canaanite pagan practices, such as child sacrifice, fertility rites, sexual perversities, etc., well, you can't have them around as a constant temptation to all those fun things. Right? Monotheism could only develop and take hold in its own home. And Telushkin on this subject quotes a comment from Walter Kaufman, which I remember reading when I was in college. I was obsessed with a number of Kaufman's books then. Kaufman was a teacher of philosophy at Princeton, kind of a renegade Jew. I still have a couple of his books that I want to read and reread somewhere down the road. He was a great thinker. Kaufman wrote, "To find the spirit of the religion of the Old Testament in Joshua is like finding the distinctive genius of America in the men who slaughtered the Indians." So, but it is true that war is ugly, and it was very ugly for the Israelites and more ugly for the Canaanites. I got to tell you, last week I saw this ad to pre-order a new children's book from an Orthodox press. It's a full color version of the book of Joshua, and it's all in rhyme, right? I'm going to bet you, sight unseen, that it's very heavily edited, because you don't really want to, teach little kids about the conquest of Canaan in great detail. Not very, it's not going to be easy for those kids to sleep after they read an unedited version of Joshua, even with pictures, especially if they're pictures of the victims. So I'll stop here for just a second. Any questions or comments up to here? Okay. Now, when the conquest is finished, the tribes divide up the land. Each of the tribes has a space of their own, except for the Levites. Levites are supposed to be the religious leadership scattered among the people, supported by all the tribes. And then we come to the book of Judges. Why is it called Judges? Because initially there were no kings, just tribal judges or people who took on leadership roles in specific crises. So for instance, one of the early judges is a woman by the name of Deborah. We know very little about her, except that, number one, she lives about 100 years after the conquest. And number two, people would come to her in judgment when she would sit in the shade of her palm tree. Hence, many Jewish books entitled Tomer Devorah, the palm tree of Deborah. And there's one episode where the Israelites need to go to war. There's always people fighting wars in that period. And she calls on a guy named Barak to take the troops and go and defeat a general named Sisera. And he says, if you will go with me, I will go. But if not, I will not. So she says, okay, but she tells him you won't get full credit for this because Sisera will be delivered into the hand of a woman. Now, you may think that's going to be Deborah, but it's not. What happens when they wind up doing battle is that while Sisera has a lot of chariots, it's the rainy season. Chariots aren't that good when there's a lot of mud in the road. They get bogged down. His forces lose the battle. Sisera runs off on foot, and he arrives at the tent of a clan leader, and the wife is home. Her name is Yael. Yael lets him in, gives him some warm milk. He's exhausted. He falls asleep, whereupon Yael kills him by hammering a tent peg into his skull. Isn't war fun? And immediately after this, we read Deborah's Song of Triumph, celebrating another win over the Canaanites, another famous piece of poetry that we find in the Tanakh. I imagine most of you are at least a little bit familiar with the story of Samson and Delilah. Samson is considered one of the judges, but he's not known for his good judgment. He's known for his strength in and out of battle. From before Samson is born, there's trouble in the neighborhood with the Philistines. By the way, that's where the name Palestine comes from, Philistines. Philistines are mainly in the coast on what is now southern Israel and Gaza. They're a significant military force. They are the dominant power in the region, and they are ruling over Israel at this time. And before Samson is conceived, his parents are visited by an angel. This is from the book of Judges. And they are told to expect a son and to raise him as a Nazirite. So what does that mean? Well, back in the book of Leviticus, when people wanted to show penitence for something bad they had done, for 30 days, they would neither cut their hair nor drink wine or any form of liquor. Now, life was hard back in those days. So if you gave up the pleasure of wine or liquor, Um, that might sort of take the edge off if you were having a tough day, which practically every day was a tough day. That was considered a significant sacrifice. Give that up for 30 days? No, that was tough. So Samson, according to this angel who visited his parents, was to be raised as a lifelong Nazirite. And his parents are also told that Samson will be the first to deliver Israel from the Philistines. So there are many legends about Samson's strength. One is that he kills a lion barehanded. That sounds impressive. Another is he kills 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of an ass. That sounds like a crack at the Philistines. Unfortunately, physical strength is not an indication of good character or good judgment. Samson marries a Philistine woman. After she died, he takes up with Philistine prostitutes. Maybe forbidden fruit or just the feeling of entitlement when you're as big and strong and, the acknowledged leader as Samson is. And then he falls in love with another Philistine woman, and that is Delilah. The Philistine leaders have been waiting for Samson to get entangled with another Philistine woman. They go to Delilah and ask her to find out the secret of his strength so that they can make him helpless, and they will pay her well. So she starts to nag him to tell her his secret, and she keeps after her. And he lies to her a couple of times. And you would think that after that, he would recognize that she was kind of a double agent there, but she keeps after him. And eventually he tells her that it's all about his hair. And so she waits until he is asleep. When his hair is gone, the Philistine soldiers pounce and they put out his eyes and put him in prison for a while. And then the Philistines plan a big party with thousands of people in their largest temple, the better to celebrate the capture of their most hated and feared enemy. And they bring out Samson, have him do a little dance, leave him between the pillars of the temple. But what they don't realize is that enough of his hair has grown back by this time. Maybe not at full strength, but enough. And he says, God, help me this one time. Let me die with the Philistines. And he pushes on the pillars. And Samson brings down the house. And it says that he killed more Philistines in his death than he had in his lifetime. Most of the rest of the book of Judges is like Joshua, the blood and guts, but with the Israelites already in the land. It's not pretty, but there is a hint of why things are so bad in the final verse of the book. And I had to share this with you. Telushkin doesn't really mention it, but I think it's very significant. It says, this is the last verse of the book of Judges, in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And this verse tells us two things. Number one, there's very little stability in this society. Occasionally the Israelites would unite behind one of the judges, but more often the tribes fought with each other or with other outside threats. There was no unifying principle among the Israelites. When there are 12 tribes standing together, they are much stronger. But when they stand alone, they are extremely vulnerable. Sometimes they did stand together, but not enough. And number two, they weren't necessarily devoted to the principles of the Torah. And I don't recall Telushkin mentioning this in his book, but most biblical scholars do not believe that the Torah was actually written down until after the monarchy was established. There were stories and stories that most people knew, and there were known to be rules. But everyone did what they thought was right. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. Keep Shabbat, don't keep Shabbat. Love your neighbor, don't love your neighbor. Don't make idols. Oh, okay, maybe you do. Right? Seems to be okay with the other folks, right? Each man did what was right in his own eyes. That is not a compliment from the author of the book of Judges, the historian. If someone isn't behaving according to the law of Moses, the prevailing thinking here is mind your own business. Doesn't sound Jewish, does it? Right? Now, so it's a very important verse and particularly apt in the context of the time of the book of Judges, which brings us up to about the middle of the 11th century before the Common Era. Okay? Questions or comments before we go farther? No questions. All right.
I do have one. I'm sorry
Yes,
to interrupt
please,
you at the
Nick.
last second. So there's not a lot of historical record that the Jews went in there and committed mass murder. So what? I guess they overwhelmed these people and then assimilated with them, or they assimilated with us.
They probably killed a bunch of them and assimilated with the rest.
Sure. The other people thought, well, it may not work out for us. Might as well join the group, right?
You can't beat them, join them.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
And probably they didn't kill all the women.
Well, yeah, for sure.
But
that's kind of.
But obviously, the women had their religion. It was Canaanite religion, and so
Right.
they kept it alive. Thanks a
Interesting.
lot. Yeah, Daniel.
I'll try to keep it short too. I heard on a documentary on PBS, for what that's worth, that the original Israelites may very well have been a breakaway sect from the original Canaanites, and that what we're really reading about is like a civil war or a revolution of some sort, that they separated and became a separate people. Do you hold any credence to that at all? I mean, I don't have an opinion. I don't know.
I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows. It's possible. However, that's not the Bible. Okay? So the founding stories of the Jewish people may not be 100% factual, but they are our stories. Okay? That's the best I can give you. I don't think there is conclusive archaeological evidence either way. Okay. Anything else? Okay. This brings us to the book of Samuel and the story of the birth of Samuel. Samuel's mother, Hannah, is one of two wives in the home of a man named Elkanah. Having more than one wife was pretty common among the prosperous men in Israel. Okay? The other wife has children, and Hannah does not. And you already know from the stories of Genesis that for a woman to be barren is a serious misfortune. And to make it worse, her co-wife is like, oh, look at me and all my children. And look at you, haha. My children will inherit everything. When our husband dies, you will be out on the street. Now, the book doesn't record those words, but I think that's a fair guess of the kind of taunting that is directed at Hannah. Okay? They go to the city of Shiloh, where there is some kind of place of worship. It's not like the future Jerusalem temple, but it is a house of God where sacrifices were brought. Elkanah brings his offerings every year, and Hannah is, terribly sad. And at some point, she leaves the family and goes into this little temple to quietly pray and to beg God to grant her a child. And she says, if God will grant me a male child, I will dedicate him to God all the days of his life. Now, the chief priest in this place is a man named Eli, and he can't hear her. but he's looking at her and he sees that her lips are moving, and he thinks she's babbling like a drunk. And he gets angry at her and chastises her. This is not how you're supposed to, you don't get drunk in the temple, right? And then she talks to him, and he realizes that she's quite sober. She's just very sad. And so he blesses her and prays that God should fulfill her prayer. Some of you will remember reading this story in the synagogue because it is the Haftarah, the special reading from the prophets on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Because we do a lot of praying on Rosh Hashanah, and it's, they derive a lot in Jewish tradition about how to pray from Hannah's words. Well, the child is born, the prayer is granted, and this is Samuel. When he is quite young, meaning as soon as he is weaned, Hannah brings him to Eli and says, remember me? My prayer was answered. And here he is, and I am bringing him to you to train him to be a man of God. I lend him to the Lord. The family keeps coming back to Shiloh every year. She brings him a linen robe every year. I guess he needs new clothes every year, right? He's growing. That's part of her contribution to the temple. So he continues as, I guess, an apprentice with chores to do in this temple. Hannah is blessed with other children, but obviously she does not forget Samuel. Eli actually has two grown sons who assist in the service, but unfortunately they are not really very pious. They take extra portions of the offerings brought there. Eli, by this time, is an old man. There is not a lot he can do to keep his sons in line. And an agent of God tells Eli that his two sons will die on the same day as a sign of God's displeasure with him. So there is a story in 1 Samuel chapter 3, which Telushkin does not mention, but I think is very important. I'm going to take a second and pull this up. I will try to put this on the share screen so you can see it as well. All right. Young Samuel is in the service of the Lord under Eli. There wasn't a lot of prophecy in that time. One day, Eli was asleep in his usual place. His eyes had begun to fail and he could barely see. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. Yes, they didn't have an eternal light the way we do in our synagogues. Samuel was sleeping in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. And the Lord called out to Samuel and he answered, I'm coming. He doesn't realize yet that it's God. He ran to Eli and said, here I am, you called me. Eli, I didn't call you, go back to sleep. Must have been a dream, right? So it went back and he lay down. And again, God called Samuel. Here I am, you called me. Eli, I didn't call my son, go back to sleep. Samuel had not yet experienced the Lord, right? Interesting phrase, right? He didn't have an experience of God's presence. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him, right? He's a future prophet, but it's still, it hasn't started yet until now. The Lord called Samuel again a third time, and he rose and went to Eli, and he said, here I am, you called me. And then Eli understood what was happening, that it was God calling. And Eli said to him, go back and lie down, and if you are called again, say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. And Samuel went back to bed. The Lord came and said, he called before, as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel answered, speak, for your servant is listening. And God says to Samuel, this is a very heavy message for a little kid, right? I am going to do in Israel such a thing that both ears of anyone who hears about it will tingle. In that day, I will fulfill against Eli all that I spoke concerning his house from beginning to end. And I declared to him that I sentence his house to endless punishment for the iniquity he knew about, how his sons committed sacrilege at will, and he did not rebuke them. Assuredly, I swear concerning the house of Eli, that the iniquity of that house will never be expiated by sacrifice or offering. Samuel lay there until morning. I mean, you imagine he's like, right? Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. He was afraid to report this, you think? Report the vision to Eli. Eli summoned him and said, Samuel, my son. He says, here. And he asked, what did God say to you? Keep nothing from me. Thus and more may God do to you if you keep from me a single word of all he said to you. Samuel then told him everything. Withholding nothing from him. And Eli said, he is the Lord. He will do what he deems right. He knows what his sons have done, and he knows he should have done more to change their path. Samuel grew up, and the Lord was with him. He did not leave any of Samuel's predictions unfulfilled. All Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, Dan is in the north, Beersheba is in the south, knew that Samuel was trustworthy as a prophet of the Lord. Okay, so what do we learn from this story? Well, thing number one is religious experience is a real thing from the point of view of the author of Scripture. Mystical experience does happen. Some people are more open to it than others. Sometimes even happens to young people. I've heard about it from, as a congregational rabbi, I've heard about it from people of all ages. As I mentioned in the introduction to my book on Jewish mysticism, of course, living in the house of God, Samuel might be more open to it, but he doesn't even realize what it is at first. Eli has to explain to him that God is talking to him. So that's the first thing we learn, that religious experience is real. Okay? Number two, we learn that Samuel grows up to become a prophet, and apparently that means that he has other communications from God. And because his honesty and his goodness are so obvious, other people accept him at face value and they trust him. Right? Lesson number three, you can train people to be Jewish leaders. You don't have to turn them over to the leadership from the time that they are weaned. Right? That might be a bit much, but you can give them experiences that provide them a sense of the holy, a sense that there's a purpose in being Jewish. It just depends on whether your goal is to blend in with the majority or to stand out. Eli's sons had another goal, get rich off of religion. Remember how we talked about the third commandment? You shall not carry the Lord's name in vain, right? If you represent religion, you have an extra responsibility to avoid misconduct. And that's what we get from them, right? Eli's sons, right? Nothing but misconduct, right? Now, unfortunately, righteous leadership doesn't guarantee success. There's no biblical magic bullet. The Israelites continue to be under Philistine oppression. It's an ongoing problem, and idolatrous practice continues to be popular. And even though Samuel has some successes bringing the Jews back to God, inspiring a victory against the Philistines here and there is a lot to be desired. And it turns out that just as Eli had problems with his sons, Samuel has problems with his sons who accepted bribes and perverted justice. So the elders of the tribes come to Samuel and they say, you're getting older. Your sons are not fit leaders. We have a fistful of challenges. We need to have a king who will lead us, who will unify us, who will keep our enemies at bay, especially the Philistines. Samuel does not like this idea because he knows that monarchy is not an ideal situation. Too much power in one man's hands, too much potential for injustice, too little faith in God. But when he consults with God about this, God tells him, I understand. They're not rejecting your leadership. They're rejecting mine. Right? This is how they are. So just warn them about the bad things a king will do, which, by the way, as we go forward in Jewish history, we'll see that kings do all of them. Okay? Warn them that he will draft your sons into his service and your daughters into, various forms of service to the monarchy or the monarch. Okay? He'll take the best of your possessions and swallow them up to support his goals and his family. He will tax you heavily. You're not going to like it in the end. You're going to cry out to God, and God will not answer you because you asked for this. So the people say, nope, we need a king. We have to be like all the other nations. Otherwise, we can't compete. Got to have a king. So here we see a tension between the religious view and the pragmatic view. The pragmatic view, and I mentioned this, Nick, you'll remember this from class on Sunday. The pragmatic view is what we today call geopolitics, right? The religious view is theopolitics, right? And there are arguments to be made for both sides. The religious view can seem very utopian and very impractical, not a good way to defend yourself against your enemies, rely on God, sure. The practical view, however, can lead to too many compromises in Jewish values, and not just the ones God warns about, and which Samuel passes on to the people. Later on, other prophets complained that kings have compromised Jewish religion, allowed idolatry even within the temple, of all places, allowing the gods of their allies a role in the religious life of Israel. And the prophets tell us that this, along with injustices of the monarchy and the upper class, cannot stand, because it undermines the foundations of the Jewish faith. But the people go ahead and they tell Samuel, pick for us a king. We're going to leave it up to you. We trust your judgment. Pick us a king. Find us the right leader. And so Samuel reluctantly finds a promising young man named Saul. And he anoints Saul as king. And Saul has some successes in battle, and the people do support him and rally around him. He is modest, but he is brave, and the people admire him. But he turns out to be seriously flawed. For one thing, as Telushkin points out, he really wants to be liked. After a battle with the Amalekites, when he's been told by God through Samuel to destroy the property of the Amalekites. Remember the Amalekites, the people who attacked the rear of the caravan in the Sinai, right? So he's been told by God to destroy their property, to destroy all of them. And instead, he gives their property to the soldiers, a reward for good service, right? He was told to kill their king, who no doubt was not a nice guy, but instead he keeps him alive, maybe because he thinks, well, could have been me, right? I'm a king, he's a king, we're both in the same line of work. But Samuel Samuel is in no mood to accept this. He kills the Amalekite king, and he says to Saul that the kingdom will be taken away from him and his descendants. After this, Samuel seeks another king. He winds up with the seventh son, right? The seventh son of a Jew from Bethlehem by the name of Jesse, and his name is David, right? Did you know that David was the seventh son? That's where the term comes from, right? So Samuel anoints David in secret, tells him that one day he will be king. It will be many years before he actually becomes king. So the first problem with Saul was that he wanted desperately to be liked. And the second problem is his own instability. He becomes depressed, he becomes delusional, he becomes paranoid, and we'll see how these things overwhelm him. Music seems to help his depression, and they find someone who can play the lyre, and guess who it is? The future king, David. And Saul initially liked him, and certainly his music. But David becomes famous as a warrior, even though he's really too young to be in the army. He's a multi-talented guy. The Philistine army has an ace in the hole, a soldier named Goliath, who appears to the Israelites to be about 9.5 feet tall. He carries a javelin, a sword, and a spear, and he challenges any Israelite soldier to take him on. And the losing side, the bet that Goliath makes, is that the losing side will become slaves to the winning side. Not a very good bet for the Israelites, to go one-on-one with a giant like that. Okay? Well, as it turns out, young David, who's too young for the army, he's sent by the family with food for 3 of his brothers who are in the army. And he finds out what's going on, and he has an idea, and he says, send me out to fight Goliath. This is like, sending a little guy about 5'2", right? To go fight a 9.5-foot warrior. King Saul hears about it, and he doesn't have any better ideas. He says, okay, you give it a try. Here's my sword, here's my armor, but all that it's much too big for David. Instead, he just goes out with a slingshot. Goliath sees him and says, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And David says, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the ranks of Israel, whom you have defied. David needs just one stone, which he shoots at Goliath's forehead, killing him immediately. Right? Might be a story, but it's a good story, right? The Philistines run off. David cuts off Goliath's head with the giant's own sword, gives it to King Saul. And David befriends King Saul's son, Jonathan, and they become very close. Well, that's all well and good, except that Saul becomes jealous of David. The people are singing about David's accomplishment. And so Saul, in his delusion phase, starts to plot a way to bring him down. David is called in to play the lyre for the king, and Saul throws a spear at him. Missed him by that much. Okay? Saul appoints him as a head of a division of the army, maybe thinking that David will be killed in the ongoing battles with the Philistines. But he just keeps winning battles, and Saul is more and more jealous because David keeps winning and winning. Everybody else just loves and admires David. Saul comes up with an idea. He says, here's my daughter Michal, who happens to like David anyway, right? And you can marry her. There's just this one hitch. You have to come up with 100 Philistine foreskins. Right. They didn't tell you this one in religious school as a kid either, right?
No.
Okay. So Saul, because Saul says, well, you have to take vengeance on the king's enemies. Saul is thinking for sure the Philistines will get him. Surprise. David brings Saul 200 Philistine foreskins. Right? And so Saul has to go ahead and give his daughter in marriage, which to boot pleases her and David no end. Plus, David continues to have great success in every campaign against the stubborn Philistines. And the book of Samuel says, Saul grew still more afraid of David, and Saul was David's enemy ever after. Let me just to summarize what we've covered here, all the things that happened to the Israelites after the death of Moses, the conquering of the 7 nations of the land and the fall of Jericho, the judges as a time of instability, every man and every tribe for themselves, Samuel, the recognized spiritual leader, Saul, the first king who goes mad with jealousy as David becomes famous in his own right. Okay, any questions before we wrap up tonight? Okay, so if you would like to do a little bit of reading for next time, I'm going to suggest 1 Samuel chapters 19 through 22. 1 Samuel 19 through 22, and we will start with that next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Hey,
Hey,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Rabbi. I appreciate
Yep.
it.
thank
You
you.
say good night.
Ashley, thank you for
Good night.
keeping us afloat.
Anytime.
All righty.
Thank
Have a good
you.
week, everyone.
Bye. See
You
you soon.
too.
Bye-bye.
Good night.